So wheat is apparently the preferred upscale choice. Barley is the everyman's choice, apparently. The biblical text suggests a 3-to-1 price differential favoring wheat, but at a price 10 times normal. The luxuries, the oil and wine, apparently are undeniable. They're not available. That's the flavor, what we infer from that. Well, where do we get famines? The subject before us seems to be famines. In some cases, famine is caused by uncontrollable weather circumstances, such as drought or flood, which disrupt the ability of the culture to raise crops or livestock. Famine is also the result of warfare, since the ravages of war can disrupt the daily ongoing economic pressures of any community vital to food production. What is notable about the 20th century, it may surprise you, is that most famines have been caused deliberately or by economic systems crippled by corrupt or dictatorial governments. This is significant in that the famines are not caused by nature or by the inability of a people to produce or gather food, but by the policies of governments looking out for their own self-interest. And it makes it impossible for their people to cope with the nature to gather and produce food. I want to highlight a lie that we encounter in our age of deceit. It's subtle, but I want to call your attention to it. Here's the definition of inflation according to Groyer's online encyclopedia. Inflation is a process in which the average level of prices increases at a substantial rate over a considerable period of time. In short, more money is required to buy a given amount of goods and services. Strangely, that's a misleading definition. That may surprise you. Subtle, but it's there. And I want you to contrast that definition with Webster's earlier unabridged dictionary back in 1957. How do they define inflation? More accurately, inflation is an increase in the amount of currency in circulation, resulting in a relatively sharp and sudden fall in its value and rise in prices. Inflation is a behavior of the money. It causes things to be more dear. But there's a distinction between these two. It's astonishing to go through the different definitions. Investopedia, economicshelp.org, the Economic Times, Business Dictionary. All of these are twisted to imply that inflation is the increase in prices. No, inflation is caused by an increase in the money that causes the prices. They confuse the cause and effect. It's subtle, but it's important for us to understand. Because you and I are subject to what I like to call the hidden theft. The hidden theft. Let's assume that 5% inflation over the time of an individual. That 5% devaluation applies not only to the money he earned this year, but to all the money left over from previous years. You with me so far? That dollar now is worth 95 cents, right? At the end of the first year, a dollar is worth 95 cents. At the end of the second year, the 95 cents is reduced again by 5%, leaving its worth at 90 cents. Doesn't sound too terrible, does it? Except it happens every year. By the time a person has worked 20 years, the government will have confiscated 64 cents of every dollar the person saved over those years, not by taxes, but by inflation. By the time he has worked 45 years, the hidden tax will be over 90%. The government will take virtually everything a person saves over his entire lifetime, not counting the income taxes. See, the mathematics is subtle. That 0.95 is raised to a power of the years. If it's 45 years, you take the 45th power of 0.95, which turns out to leave you less than 9% from what you've earned over those 45 years. Subtle and very invisible. We're dealing with now hyperinflation, when inflation gets out of control. We saw it happen repeatedly in the 20th century. It may surprise you to put this in focus. 1921 in Poland, food prices doubled every 19 days. In 1923, Germany, they doubled every 4 days. In 1944, in Greece, they doubled every 4 days. In 1946 in Hungary, food prices doubled every 15 hours. And in government-engineered famines even more in our more recent times. In 1982 in Mexico, the inflation rate hit over 10,000%, driving the price of food up 100 times in 12 months. Can you imagine? 1989, Argentina. The peso was devalued 3 times, driving food prices up over 3,000% in a single year. In 1994, Brazil, inflation raged at 2,000% per year, making food more than 20 times as expensive. It had nothing to do with food availability. It has to do with the money. In 1994, in Yugoslavia, food prices doubled every 34 hours. In 2008, in Zimbabwe, they doubled every single day. If you make a list of these, it's really a shock to realize how often there have been hyperinflations in this century. In Angola, Argentina, Belarus, Bolivia, Bosnia-Herzegovina, Brazil, Chile, Georgia, the Georgia in the east, Greece, Hungary, Israel, Japan, Nicaragua, Peru, Poland, Romania, Turkey, Ukraine, Yugoslavia, and so forth. The one that's most indelibly tattooed in our memories is Germany. In 1919 through 1923, the food prices doubled every 49 hours. A loaf of bread in 1920 cost 1 mark. A loaf of bread in 1923 cost 726 million marks, by the way. The best documented hyperinflation episode in history is the one that nearly destroyed Germany between 1922 and 1923. The German government began printing unbacked paper marks, first to finance World War I, and later to pay war reparations. And we have those. I'll have them on the screen for you, but let you know that we actually have the specimens of that period. So we have the 10,000 mark notes. That was in 1922. We have the individual little marks, 19. But then we had sheets printed that were 500,000 marks, 500,000 marks in 1st of August. And then we get to the 3 million mark notes. These are actual notes they have with 3 million marks. It's astonishing to actually look and realize that these aren't hypothetical charts, dots on a chart or something. These were what they lived with. This is what they had to deal with. And it's staggering for us to really come to terms with that. 20 August 23. And then we had finally marks, 50 million marks on a single piece. Okay, 10 September. It finally gets to the point they don't even bother printing the back. They're trying to get them out, so the back is blank. And 31 December 23. Now, by late 1923, 300 paper mills and 2,000 printing presses worked round the clock, cranking out German banknotes, going through these various stages. The human toil was devastating. On average, prices doubled every 3 days. Can you imagine trying to live that way? It had nothing to do with the quality of the food, it had to do with the money. In a single month, prices exploded more than 32,000%, enough to drive prices up by a factor of 320 in a single 30-day period. My grandparents, my mother's mother and father, had a restaurant that they sold to retire. They had, when it went for sale, they were going to get enough to retire on. By the time the formalities were completed, all they received was enough to buy 1 loaf of bread. In those days, in 1923, a loaf of bread cost 726 million marks. Obviously, destroy it, wipe them out. These crises are entirely man-made. They were deliberate. That may come as a shock. Their nation's leaders made them by creating unbacked paper money out of thin air. That's the case in each one of those hyperinflation examples I put there. The German one is the most dramatic and the most well documented. So what does this have to do with you and me today? Everything. Quite simply, everything. Why? Germany sank into the most severe hyperinflationary period in recorded history. After doing what? After printing 1.3 trillion marks. That translates in today's terms about $4 trillion in US dollars. Okay? Ironically, the United States government has printed exactly the same amount of money since 2008. The same amount that brought the German hyperinflation has already been achieved by the U.S. Behavior since 2008. And that's only the tip of the iceberg. I'm using America because it'll impact everybody. But the problem is much bigger. That's only the tip of the iceberg, as they say. The European Union has printed over 500 billion euros. That's equivalent to about over 600 billion US dollars. Japan has printed 180 trillion. Notice that different word there. Trillion yen, equal to about $1.5 trillion. The UK has printed over 300 billion pounds, equal to almost 500 billion, $500 trillion. Altogether, that's over $6 trillion. See, the other thing I want to get across, and you've heard me of this before, but bear with me, we have a new vocabulary. There's a new word in our vocabulary that everybody uses, and I've yet to find anyone can explain it to me that really understands what a trillion is. Let's talk not dollars, some other abstraction. Let's talk seconds. Okay, I owe you some money. I'll pay you what I owe you in 1,000,000 seconds. When you grab your calculator out and you discover 1,000,000 seconds, well, that's 12 days. I can live with that. I'll pay you what I owe you in 12 days. You can deal with that. Oh, excuse me, I misspoke. I didn't mean 1,000,000 seconds. I'll pay you what I owe you in 1,000,000,000 seconds. Well, you're a little concerned. You get out your calculator. What's 1,000,000,000 seconds? 32 years. I argue that that's not a quantitative difference. It's qualitatively different. You can live with 12 days, maybe even 2 or 3 times that, but not 1,000 times different than. You go from 12 days to 32 years, going from million to billion, 12 days to 32 years. Oh, but excuse me, I'm really not contemporary here. I want to pay you what I owe you in 1 trillion seconds. You say, really? Yeah, 1 trillion seconds. How much is that? 32,000 years. I want that to sink in, because we use these words so casually. I've trafficked with legislators and executives that use the word trillion with no grasp of what it means. And I remember I even had an occasion with Dr. Edward Teller. He and Norris Keeler were talking something, and they were using the number 10 to the 15th for a certain purpose. And I said, wow, that's more than there are seconds in the history of the universe. They both looked at me startled. Says, you do the math. You're the one that tell me that you're the one that would tell me the universe is about 16 billion years old. Do the math. That's only 10 to the 15 seconds. And it's shot. They use at Livermore and elsewhere these numbers all the time. But even there, without really grasping what you're dealing with, going from million to billion to trillion is going from 12 days to 32 years and 32,000 years as a measurement of time. We have no grasp. When we talk about $1.6 trillion as our deficit, that's not our budget. That's the amount by which we're missing our budget by. It gets worse. Our insurmountable debt has been estimated about $222 trillion at last count. And that's by Lawrence Kotlikoff, which is widely regarded as the expert in this kind of thing, widely expected expert, and using the Congressional Budget Office numbers, using their numbers, he feels that our debt, the U.S. debt, is about $222 trillion. Why? Not the 17 trillion you heard about. That's the cash. That's the cash deficit. But there's over 200 trillion unfunded liabilities for Social Security, Medicaid, entitlement programs. What does that all mean? See, that's over $500 million per person for every man, woman, and child in the United States. That's the enslavement that's already there. The U.S. government borrows 4 out of every $10 it spends. The McKinsey, who is arguably the largest, most prestigious management consulting firm in the world, their Global Institute has just recently calculated what they believe is the amount of the total wealth of the entire planet Earth. Take all the wealth on the planet Earth and try to come up with an estimate of that. And they're experts at that sort of thing. And their estimate was that it's about $200 trillion. Well, wait a minute here. What you're telling me is that at $222 trillion, the current U.S. fiscal gap, or debt, is 11% larger than all the accumulated wealth existing in the world today. There's something out of whack here. Will that ever be repaid? Of course not. Not with any legitimate currency. And so, staggering stuff. You know, Rothschild is famous for saying, "Let me issue and control a nation's money, and I care not who writes the laws." That undergirds the whole Rothschild strategy from the 19th century on, and a very effective strategy. Karl Marx said much the same thing. He says, money plays the largest part in determining the course of history, and he's absolutely right. He's absolutely right about that. The encroaching darkness that we see coming, we need to look this in the eye. As we continue to see corruption everywhere. We're in the age of deceit. We're in more ways than we probably enumerate. Throughout the highest levels of government, it's now common to cheat. In our entertainments, in our schools, and in many of our churches. Everywhere you look. Not asking you to change it, just be aware of it, be sensitized to it. Many of those in the corridors of power should be incarcerated for treason. The congressman and senator took an oath of office to protect the Constitution. They don't. Legislators signed bills they haven't even read. That ought to be a treasonable offense. Executives are allowed to ignore the laws. Widespread, all kinds. Judges who reverse juries, amend laws, and indulge in social engineering rather than dealing with what they're called to do. Leaders who fail to exhibit the most elementary ethical conduct. Ethical conduct is an anachronism. I spent 30 years in the corporate boardrooms. That was not true back then. It certainly is today. The entertainment industry celebrates every imaginable evil and attacks all the family values which God has established for our welfare. The entertainment systematically is under attack of those very things. The educational establishment deliberately dumbs down and corrupts our youth. The agenda in our national educational program is indoctrination, not education. There was a day you could rely on the fiduciary posture of our advisors, counselors, and professionals. Today, that would be naive and hazardous. Every day, the litany of non-constitutional abuses continues unabated. Every day, self-destructive policies extend their reach. Every day, it grows darker. Every day, the debts grow larger. They are already beyond any semblance of reality. But by the way, so let's be clear about this. It's not our job to predict the future. Divination is expressly prohibited in the Torah. Bible prophecy is not given to predict the future. It's given to glorify God when it occurs. Big difference. Subtle, but very important. Pericles said it so well. All right, the key is not to predict the future, but to be prepared for it. You have no obligation to predict the future, but you do have an obligation to be prepared for whatever storms are coming. That's your responsibility. It is our responsibility to prepare for the coming storms, whatever they may be. And that should weigh heavy on the head of every household. That's an obligation. You can't escape. It's there. The Bible instructs us to not be ignorant of Satan's devices. 2 Corinthians 2:11. You've all heard that before. But that's an imperative. That's an assignment given to us by our Creator, to not be ignorant of Satan's devices. Paul develops this theme. He warns us that we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of darkness of this world, against spiritual wickednesses in high places. That's the reality. That's our challenge. And by the way, it's for a better understanding of these forces that we will next explore some of the most bizarre events of America's history. There's some aspects of American history that may surprise you, and it's going to impact every one of us. So in our next session, we're going to go into some areas that are going to be very, very controversial, very alarming, very disturbing, and yet I believe it's my view that it's important for us not to be deceived. There's an imperative by our Lord himself, be not deceived. How do you do that? By finding out the truth, finding out what's really going on. And in our